The story begins with the Duchy of Winter, immersed in the cold, frosty atmosphere of the forest. The large palace, illuminated by the sun, proudly stood out among its rays. Silence reigned all around. A hand in a white glove squeezed the handle, splashing drops of blood, red marks flying around. The man in the top hat grinned. "Look at that," the other one said. "They said he was her favorite." Evelyn stood over the bloody man and said, "Impudent boy. He turned out to be a simple toy." The young man, wounded and weakened, was breathing heavily with his head down. Evelyn looked straight ahead, her gaze stern and unyielding. "Just try to say a word." The wounded and humiliated man squeezed out the words. "Putting this on. Naturally me." The man lay in front of Evelyn and finished his thought. "You said you loved me." Two women watched the scene. One exclaimed, "Oh my God, so that rumor was real?" Evelyn whispered contemptuously, "Love?" Then Evelyn laughed and asked sarcastically, "Do you seriously believe this? That naive, or just stupid? You completely forgot your place because I played with you." Evelyn's hand was clutching the whip. Drops of blood were running down it. Evelyn stood there with the bloody whip, her gaze cold. She said, "You're just disgusting." 10 years have passed since those events. The atmosphere in the duchy remains harsh and unapproachable. The sun's rays penetrated the decorated hall, illuminating the golden decorations and flower arrangements. The young maid smiled at the man as he pulled her towards him abruptly. She exclaimed. The man held the maid tightly despite her protests. "Quiet, everyone is busy. What if she finds out?" The man turned the maid to face him and said, "Turn around, again! Why are you doing this?" The man pressed himself tenderly against the maid, his words muffled. Hugging the maid, the man looked at the portrait of his mistress and muttered, "It's all because you're a villain, because your appearance has become so damn hot." The girl exclaimed, "You are a real pervert." The man's hand gently brushed the maid's hair, his touch soft and gentle. The man grinned, his eyes glittering with cunning. He said, "If you look at it that way, there is nothing special about this icy presence." The man looked up, his voice thoughtful. One day, that arrogant face would also distort. Suddenly, the door swung open, and a woman in black entered the hall, attracting attention with her appearance. The man and the half-naked maid looked at the woman who entered in confusion. It was Evelyn Winter who stood there, glaring at the pair. Evelyn was the head of the family. Just a few moments later, cries for mercy could be heard throughout the area around the once quiet castle. The man and the maid fell to the floor. "Please spare me, mistress. I have committed a mortal sin." Evelyn's voice was cold. "Take pity? After you admitted that it was a mortal sin?" Evelyn opened the box. "Well, I'll give you a choice since you ask for it. Slowly freeze to death." Evelyn pointed the gun at the man and added, "Or be killed with one shot. Which is better?" The maid begged Evelyn, "Please spare me, mistress. I won't do it again." The man trembled in front of Evelyn, his voice full of fear. "So please be merciful." Loud shouts came from the stairs. "Isaac, you know my situation, right? Please help me." Isaac suddenly hit the man, who cried out in pain. Then the man ran down the stairs, shouting, "Joseph!" Evelyn said coldly with a weapon in her hand, "Do you even care about my honor?" "How amazing!" Evelyn pointed the gun at the man. "Then for the glory of the Winters. Be a good man, just shut up and die." The maid clung to the man in fear. "Then, I promise that your coffin will be golden." Evelyn held the gun, her face impassive, and she said, "How about this? She will kill us. Evelyn Winter. Do you think your name will protect you forever? The era of the nobility is over." Someone shouted, "Go to hell!" Then Evelyn fired. Her eyes were blazing with anger. The bullet missed. And the man and the woman continued to run, disappearing into the distance, leaving behind only footprints in the snow. They moved away as quickly as they could to avoid losing their lives. Evelyn and Isaac stood on the balcony, looking out over the deserted gardens of the duchy. Silence surrounded them. "Let's say the error is too big. Tell them to focus on producing shells. It looks like your departure will be delayed because the sea is frozen." Evelyn asked, "Will it last a day or two?" Suddenly, without answering the question, Isaac shouted, "Lady!" Evelyn immediately turned around, after which the little girl in the red dress ran out of the door, and the maid ran after her screaming, "You can't go out." The girl's name was Sherry, and she was looking straight at Evelyn. And the maid said, "Mistress, forgive the noise." Evelyn crouched down in front of Sherry. Her voice softened, and she said, "It's okay, Sherry." The Duchess picked up Sherry and calmed the baby down. The wolf appeared and chased them away. "There's nothing to be afraid of here." Evelyn hugged Sherry and asked, "What did you draw this time?" Evelyn looked closely at Sherry, who was taking out a piece of paper with a drawing. Sherry showed a drawing of a flower, and Evelyn immediately muttered. "Flower?" Evelyn said. "I've never seen flowers like these here. Did you copy it from a book?" Evelyn then leaned over to Sherry, who was delighted with her drawing. Evelyn's gaze became attentive and thoughtful, and then she plunged into her memories. The tower stood against the backdrop of a green forest, symbolizing the tranquility and grandeur of the surrounding world. The guy held a blue rose in his hands and said, "Lady, this is for you." The guy approached Evelyn, who was sitting by the tree. What was this? He explained that he had it done in a studio. The man's voice was full of uncertainty. "If you don't like it, you can throw it away." Evelyn looked at the flower carefully, and the guy added, "I thought I should show it to you first." The girl looked first at the flower, then at the man in front of her, and said, "Beautiful." Evelyn held the rose, her face taking on a sad expression. What a pity it had no scent. The young man, watching Evelyn's reaction, was shocked because he didn't think she would like it. The man stood under the tree, looking at Evelyn. He said, "Once. Real flowers. Remember, one day I will bring you real flowers no matter what." And then the image of his dead body came back to me. He was lying on the ground in a pool of his own blood. Evelyn finally came out of her memories of this man. It was too tragic. Sitting in the Countess's arms, Sherry said, "They say blue daisies have a very pleasant smell. Shall we try later?" The girl looked ahead and answered calmly, "Good." Evelyn walked away from the hall, her silhouette moving away in the direction of the exit. The door suddenly swung open, rays of light streaming in. One of the servants burst into the room and exclaimed, "Go away, madam! We are in big trouble! All goods brought from the north are confiscated and searched." The military said it would hunt down reactionary elements. All ships were confiscated. Meanwhile, the carriage wheel braked sharply, raising a cloud of snow and dust. The flag with the coat of arms fluttered in the wind and shimmered with light. Evelyn frowned, her voice filled with anger. "They dare to search me?" The soldiers crowded around the main gate, looking serene and lighting a cigarette for their captain. Evelyn asked loudly, "Who dared?" She didn't know yet that this person was someone important. Standing before Evelyn was Gillas Black, an assistant to the Atteric army who had been in battle for over a year. Why is he working here? It seems he was assigned as a means of transporting supplies for the enemy. The man in dark clothes, holding his hands to his chest, said, "You must be careful. This gentleman, he is the devil incarnate, dressed in a military uniform. All his subordinates are afraid to even pronounce his name, so they simply call him Colonel." Two men stood in front of a large gate. One of them asked, "Should I pull him out?" The colonel stood in front of the building, holding a cigarette in his hand, and said, "No, I have to say hello first." The colonel stepped forward, his steps sounding firm, and the door opened with a loud creak, after which the soldiers entered the hall, holding their weapons at the ready. The aristocrat's eyes reflected confusion at such an unexpected raid on them. The man in uniform apologized, his voice mocking. He said, "Sorry for dirtying your door." The man looked at his shoes and said, "There was no time to clean the soles. Many years have passed." Evelyn looked at the colonel in shock, and the man continued, "The reception will not be cheap." Suddenly, her pupils dilated because she remembered this man. The Duchess remembered how several years ago she had looked at this man with a contemptuous gaze. He, covered in blood, grabbed her hand and begged for mercy. But Evelyn didn't even think about sparing him. She looked at him like he was trash that couldn't live on this earth. Then the man realized that he was being treated like a thing, and, gathering all his will, he said, "You will regret this moment for a long time, mark my words." Now that wounded boy had become a man in uniform. Adjusting his headdress, he said, "It's too late to say hello." Looking at Evelyn and Sherry, he added, "Long time no see." He called her Miss Evie. That made the girl tighten her fingers on Sherry's shoulder, after which Evelyn wanted to say something in response, but the colonel interrupted her. "Exactly! Now you're Mrs. Winter. How could I forget?" As soon as he took off his cap, Evelyn immediately examined his face. Her guess was confirmed. It was that same kid. The majestic palace towered over the snowy expanses. The snow-white domes sparkled in the sun. The flag fluttered in the wind. A voice spoke. In the name of the king. A group of officers stood in front of the gate. One of them said, "The Duchess of Winter is suspected of selling supplies." Because of the commotion, many people gathered around. One of the soldiers said, "All members of the ducal family are required to cooperate." The maid and the butler continued to stand there, confused. The butler said, "It doesn't concern us, right?" Evelyn's cane hit the ground with a loud thud. Someone exclaimed. Evelyn stood looking at the crowd and said, "Don't make a fuss. I won't be able to forgive you." Then the girl went up the stairs, followed by the maid, and added, "Bring me the same tea." Without reaching the end, she froze on the steps with a cold expression on her face. Discontent slid across her face. Meanwhile, the man stood in the middle of the chambers, holding a cigarette in his hands. He looked into the distance, thinking about something important. He approached the window, thoughtfully watching what was happening. The Duchess of Winter looked determined in his eyes. In fact, the Altaric monarchy was famous for its brave knights, but it was not always so. Thanks to the military might of the royal family, it survived among the great powers. But ordinary people continued to suffer from the ongoing military conflicts, and dissatisfaction with the royal family and the nobility grew ever worse. But like a falling star, a hero appeared. He achieved everything on his own. Gillas Black, unknown origin, black beast, demon of battle, dirty mercenary, a showy chess piece to calm down confused people. But no matter what, this man always won. He transformed from a commoner into a war hero and the only hope of the people. Meanwhile, Evie was drinking tea, and the man standing in front of her continued to bombard her with questions. "Where is Rowan Winter?" "Who?" "Rowan Winter." "I'm asking about the whereabouts of your husband." The lady raised her cup and asked mockingly, "How did an idiot who couldn't read become a war hero?" The young man frowned and replied coldly, "Despite the fact that the reports clearly recorded his death." Gillas continued speaking. "We didn't find the body." After these words, the girl froze in place, and then she screamed, "So you dare say that you dug up my husband's grave?" The guy took the papers in his hands and started leafing through them. "There are too many gaps in this situation. 10 years ago, you married Rowan Winter. 3 years later, he died in a train accident." Gillas focused his gaze on a point and continued, "What a tragedy. But witnesses to the incident do not understand why nothing was left of the body." Gillas picked up the documents and said, "The movement of funds for the last 7 years does not match the accounting book." The man then looked at Miss Evie and asked, "Did Rowan Winter fake his own death and try to secretly commit treason?" Evelyn raised her eyebrows in surprise, her gaze betraying confusion. Evelyn's mad laughter echoed through the room. She said, "What nonsense!" Having finished laughing, the girl leaned back in her chair and grinned. "Don't you think you should have become a writer instead of a soldier?" Gillas stepped forward and suggested, "Let's change the way the question is phrased. Why were you faithful to your dead husband all these years?" There were many opportunities to remarry. Then Evelyn didn't look at Gillas and answered reservedly, "Because I love him." Gillas looked away, considering her words. The girl with the cup lowered her eyes and added quietly, "Because I still love him." Evelyn continued to drink her tea calmly, as if nothing had happened. Gillas seemed strange to her. Gillas frowned at her answer and said, "That's funny." The man covered his mouth with his hand and said, "Devilish love. You could have become a writer yourself." Then she raised her cup sharply and asked with a hint of irony, "Really?" The lady suddenly sprinkled tea on the man's head. "I don't think it's funny." The soldier didn't know how to react to this and cried out, "What? Colonel! If you line up your soldiers and point your blades at me, do you really think I'll be afraid?" Evelyn and Gillas stood next to each other. Evelyn asked for evidence so as not to insult her husband. The teacup fell to the floor, spinning in the air, reflecting the tense moment. Evelyn was serious. Evelyn said, "I don't have time for these games. Get out now." The man then turned sideways, his face covered by a mask. He looked tired. The pompous staircase in the luxurious hall was filled with soft light, creating an atmosphere. Evelyn walked down the stairs, leaning on her cane. Her steps were majestic. She frowned, looking straight ahead, her gaze determined. Evelyn turned to Sherry. Evelyn asked, "Sherry, were you very scared?" The girl repeated the same thing. "Now everything is fine." But Sherry looked strange. Gillas stood right behind the smiling Evelyn. The girl could not notice him. The man looked at the girl. She turned to him. He said, "Madam," Gillas said, "there is something I have not mentioned." The girl turned to him with distrust. A man and a woman stood on the stairs. She said, "I don't want to listen." He replied, "You must listen to me." Contraband being transported to an enemy country on a transport ship was seized. Evelyn frowned when she heard, "If you do not prove your innocence, you will have to say goodbye to life." She looked at the man, smiling slightly, her lips trembling with suppressed emotions. After a moment's silence, she said, "It's old-fashioned to threaten when talking about death." He turned away, clearly hesitant. The lady looked at him defiantly and said, "You better get on your knees and beg for mercy, like before." The man knelt down in front of the girl, clutching her legs. He was covered in blood, after which he turned around, tears streaming down his face, leaving marks on his dirty skin. Evelyn said that if he didn't know how to do it, he should remember the old days. The young man looked at her attentively, his face expressing thoughtfulness. The colonel held the end of the cane confidently, holding it resolutely in his hand and not allowing himself to be hit. Then he took the cane from the girl, and she was seriously surprised by this. The soldier made a strange movement, pulling Evelyn towards him. She certainly didn't expect that. The man pressed Evelyn to himself, hugging her, and said, "Madam?" The girl was perplexed. The girl in the red dress stood and watched everything, and then the man asked, "The child is still small, isn't he?" Gillas approached Evelyn and whispered in her ear, "Please." But the blonde lowered her head, hiding her emotions. Her eyes sparkled with tension and anxiety. Then the man carefully extended his hand, and the girl allowed him to touch it. Gillas gently let go of the girl's hand, taking his time. His gaze was filled with sadness and regret. The man, walking towards the stairs, said, "Let's take a break for today. See you tomorrow." After which, the man left Evie and Sherry and went about his business. Evelyn looked at her interlocutor with surprise and concern. He threw out another phrase, "Lady!" On the floor near the stairs lay an abandoned cane, glittering in the light. Altric's most loyal subject. He was granted territory in the north, from which he made a fortune. The Duke's family was well off, and he did not hesitate to resort to illegal methods to expand his business. People in the crowd shouted insults. "How dare you? Aristocrats are too arrogant." But Rowan became the youngest and best graduate of the academy. He was an adopted child, which caused controversy. But 3 years later, he disappeared, and only his wife remained, Evelyn Winter. Instead of grieving over the loss of her husband, she continued her inhuman commercial expansion. The crowd screamed in outrage, "What is this? It's too expensive. This woman will destroy the family." Even if all sorts of gossip appeared, she simply continued to laugh at them. However, the Winter family's business began to gradually collapse. Due to the lack of a successor, the prestige of the duchy fell. The cup was abruptly placed on the table, leaving marks. The noise from the impact could be heard. Evelyn was sitting at the table. There were 2 people nearby. She asked a question. "What did you just say?" A military man sat opposite her and answered seriously, "I want to buy your title and lands," after which, deathly silence immediately fell in the huge hall. Then Lady Winter frowned and said, "How stupid! Do I look like I need money?" The young man with the papers in his hands explained, "The rate of gold production has decreased significantly." He then presented the documents to Lady Winter and added, "I would prefer to end this on my own terms." Evelyn stared at the documents, and suddenly someone said, "It is to your advantage, madam." She put the documents on the table next to the tea. "Please read them. You think you'll have support." The man looked at the papers and sighed. The other said, "This is not something you can resist." Sitting in a chair and leaning on her arm, she said, "Worried about me. How generous, Colonel." The man raised his eyebrows and said with a grin, "Then just sign it." Evelyn slapped the paper and screamed, "But the only one who can take pity on me. This is His Majesty the King. How dare you talk about profit?" Isak stood behind the man, looking around nervously. The girl said, "Isak, get ready." As soon as dawn comes, I will go to the royal castle, she said. The starry sky was covered with clouds. The luminous stars, hidden behind these clouds, were shining. The candle shone in the darkness of the room and seemed to be the only source of light on the frosty night. The woman sat by the window, holding a candle in her hand and looking at the dark sky. Her thoughts were full of sadness and thoughtfulness. Clutching the fabric of her clothes, she said, "Impudent devil." Her indignation clearly spoke of what had happened. Someone was approaching. "Do you think it will be that simple?" The Duchess's voice sounded distrustful. Evelyn sat in a chair, flying in her thoughts, and in the meantime, someone approached her. Evelyn turned sharply, her fist ready to strike. "Who's there?" But fortunately, it was Sherry who scared Evelyn to death with her appearance. Winter hit Sherry on the arm anyway, so she immediately ran up to the girl and asked, "Are you okay?" After which, having made sure that Sherry was okay, she sighed and said, "Calm down." After a while, she held Sherry in her arms and whispered. She finally calmed down. Looking at the child with alarm, she thought, "I obviously felt something." Sherry was sleeping soundly. Evelyn said softly, "Yes. No need to hurry." Holding Sherry close, she said, "I am the head of Winter. No one can take that away from me. Ever." At some point, the candle went out. Now a thin stream of white smoke was coming from it. They fell asleep, huddled together in the chair. Night was falling. After some time, Sherry woke up and looked sleepily at her mother. Evelyn was deep in sleep, her face expressing peace and fatigue. Sherry thought that she should wrap her in a warm blanket, because the room was not very warm. That's why the girl immediately and quietly ran for a blanket. She continued to sleep in the chair, not even noticing that the girl had gone somewhere. Then Dark Boots stopped at the chair where Evelyn was sleeping. Her peace was disturbed. It was the Colonel. He came up with a plate, his gaze directed at the sleeping woman. Looking at her, he heard her mutter something unintelligible in her sleep. Evelyn dozed and said quietly in her sleep, "Rowan." Her voice was barely audible. Gillas looked at her thoughtfully, his face remaining calm and cool. The Colonel came closer and said, "Wake up." Evelyn flinched slightly at his words. She rose from her chair, trying to understand what was happening. The Colonel said, "You haven't eaten anything today." Then he handed her the soup and calmly added, "Eat." Looking down, her face expressed tiredness and thoughtfulness. But the man said again, "Otherwise you will faint." But the Duchess made a face and answered discontentedly, "Bribing is bad. Take it away." Suddenly, the Colonel gently touched her face, running his hand over her cheek. He said, "You have a fever." The Colonel leaned closer, looking into her eyes and asked, "Does it hurt when you swallow?" After which she abruptly pushed his hand away and shouted, "What are you doing?" The girl looked at him with complete bewilderment in her eyes. "Before, when you were unwell, you wouldn't even take a bite." "It's a bad habit, madam." Looking at him with disgust, her voice sounded cold. "What are you trying to achieve?" The Colonel thought for a moment, then quietly repeated, "Revenge?" He continued, "Well?" Suddenly, he approached her with a spoon in his hand and said, "Doesn't this only work on a healthy opponent?" Evelyn frowned, her eyes shining with exhaustion. This wasn't something to do to someone so weakened. He reached out his hand to her, but she rose abruptly, pushing him away. Her movement was quick. Evelyn felt the Colonel's hand tighten around her neck, her eyes burning with anger. He grabbed her by the shoulders, holding her with force. She screamed. The Colonel looked at her with a cold gaze. He said, "Don't move. I thought you had more strength." She looked at him, her face filled with anger. Wasn't that too much? Gillas held a plate of food, but she hid her face in her hands. He said, "I don't have a spoon, but—" The Colonel leaned closer, his face very close. "There are many ways to feed you." The Colonel's finger touched her lips. The Colonel leaned toward her ear, his voice firm. "Don't resist." Her eyes widened in surprise. She couldn't believe what was happening. Then Evelyn remembered how passionately she kissed this very man. Her face turned red with emotion. But in reality, Gillas forcibly brought the plate of food to her mouth, and she screamed in fear. He held her head, insisting, "Throw away your useless stubbornness." Looking down, his gaze remained cold and penetrating. Life is about giving and taking. Gillas force-fed Evelyn, holding her face. She tried to hold back, but the food ran down her lips. She looked haggard and angry. Her face was dirty. Not too bad. She looks great. Rowan leaned down, his face set in determination. He wasn't going to stop. Sherry suddenly appeared behind Rowan with a determined expression on her face, her hands clenched into small fists. He turned around when he heard footsteps behind him, his gaze remaining intense and serious. The girl, clenching her teeth and frowning, pulled at her pigtails, expressing obvious indignation and rage. The little girl stood behind Rowan, and Evelyn sat in a chair nearby, her body slumped lifelessly. He walked up the stairs, addressing the Duchess. "Eat all you have left." Sherry leaned toward Evelyn, who was hugging her. "Or do you want to go to the palace on your own 2 feet?" With her head down, she looked down thoughtfully and depressed, her face expressing an internal struggle and fatigue. The dark mountains were visible against the sky. The rain poured down in sheets, creating an atmosphere of melancholy and emptiness. A woman in a blue coat and a man in a work apron stood under the awning. God! The hunt was going to be hopeless. They exchanged glances, their hands slowly meeting. Until the rain stops, the man and woman's hands continued to reach out to each other, the moment full of hesitation. The woman in the hat raised her head and looked forward, her face expressing uncertainty and indecision. Evelyn watched the man in the green apron, her gaze wary, as if she expected something from him. The man, slightly wet from the rain, spoke. "You could have stayed here. I'll call someone." She then took the man's hand, despite the falling rain, as if they had decided to stay together. "Are you sane?" the woman said. The man replied, "I'm worried you might catch a cold." The man, his face sunken, his hair wet from the rain, spoke. "You're lying. Your body is even hotter than mine." The girl carefully brushed the hair from the man's forehead. His cheeks flushed. The woman came closer. During a dialogue, people look into each other's eyes. "I think you should get a haircut." After her words, the man abruptly looked away, his eyes full of embarrassment and his face flushed. As he left, the man said, "I'll be quick." Evelyn shouted, "No, stay!" Evelyn looked serious. "Stay with me, that's an order." He looked away, his face showing hesitation and inner struggle. She stared at the man. Just one word from her made his gaze become absent-minded. The Duchess stood in front of him, holding his face and saying, "Don't forget, Gillas, you're mine." The woman brought her face closer to the man, her words sounding decisive. "You are the only thing I have." The man's hand clenched into a fist nervously, and he whispered uncertainly, "Yes, lady." The girl recalled these moments and did not understand what was guiding her then. She thought that his clumsy but powerful movements betrayed her stupid and handsome man. Evelyn snapped out of her memories. She was supposed to be heading to the palace today. One of the servants was sitting by the carriage. "I'm sure everything was fine until yesterday." The carriage broke down. She cursed with her cane and thought, "I had to get to the palace," someone said. "Any problems?" A black-gloved hand touched the handle of another carriage. A strong voice insisted on its proposal. The colonel stood by his carriage and invited the Duchess to go with him. Evelyn didn't even turn around. She turned to her servant. "Dylan, how long will the repairs take?" The man looked down, afraid of the lady's reaction, saying, "About 3 o'clock." She didn't have that kind of time now. Gillas and the Duchess in the black coat stood nearby. "Colonel, then, we'll leave in 3 hours." He looked away with a serious expression. A slight irritation was visible on his face. He remained silent. The colonel in the black glove grabbed her hand tightly, his gesture full of determination. The woman in the blue coat looked surprised, her eyes widening as her arm was grabbed. The man picked her up in his arms, her face expressing surprise and confusion. The woman in the blue coat looked at the stranger with bewilderment. "What the? I think you're mistaken." The man with a cold expression replied, looking ahead. "We're not going on a picnic." 3 servants watched what was happening, their eyes fixed ahead. He said, "You were supposed to accompany, but now I will carry you myself. Everyone is watching." The lady in the blue coat screamed in defiance, her face filled with determination. "Let go!" 2 soldiers in uniform stood nearby. One of them exclaimed, "How dare you touch with your dirty hands? This lady—" The gentleman looked at the situation with a serious expression. He said, "Can you take care of the situation?" A hand, clenched into a fist, appeared in front of the carriage door. Someone said, "I'll make you beg for forgiveness." The lady in the blue dress found herself on the floor of the carriage. She was stunned and screamed. Her eyes shone with determination. You should soberly assess the current situation. She watched the scene carefully, her thoughts betraying her anxiety. This man really. The subject in the dark coat stood opposite the woman in the carriage. Who should I feel sorry for now? The carriage wheels slowly began to move. She said, "Back off." They sat opposite each other inside the carriage. The atmosphere was tense. Gillas said sadly, "I'm glad you're feeling better." The man in uniform, holding a newspaper on his lap, said, "It seems yesterday's meal helped you." The lady in the blue dress sat opposite, holding a cane. "Don't be fooled. I think I'm going to throw up." He glanced briefly and sighed silently, unfolding the newspaper. "If you need it so much, please come this way. It will be a hassle if the carriage gets dirty." The woman looked away with a tired expression on her face, as if considering her next steps. "Are you always so cocky when you open your mouth? Your arrogance is off the charts," she said with irritation. Added, "In the past, you couldn't even look me in the eye." The man leaned slightly and said, "Definitely, in the past. I was just like that." He was about to rise from his seat, which clearly did not bode well. She was surprised. "I can't find anything in common between him and the one I knew." Evelyn noticed the absence of those traits she had once known in the man. There was no trace of him left. He sat with his head down, lost in his thoughts. The atmosphere around him was tense and quiet. The girl gripped the cane so tightly that her hand turned white, filled with emotion. "Why?" she asked. The girl threatened the man who was on his knees. "You don't leave when I tell you to. Let go." The boy on the ground defended himself, his face showing fear. "Lady, I don't know why you're acting like this." She pushed her hair out of her face, her expression turning somber, as the man said, "I was wrong." The three young men stood aside as the young man continued. "I'll do anything." The guy with a sad look said, "So please don't leave me." Evelyn looked irritated and confused. "You didn't understand me at all." She hit the young man sharply, saying angrily, "I don't want to see you, so get out already." After the blow, she remained standing with a serious face, and traces of blood appeared on her clothes. The man has his head down, and there are traces of blood on his face. He looked confused and surprised, his face and hair stained with blood. The black glove slowly extended, as if about to touch someone. A gloved hand gently touched the boy's head, checking his condition. The officer in uniform looked stern. His face was serious. There was someone's hand nearby. Gillas asked, "What are you doing?" He looked at the woman, holding her hand. The man stared at the girl, continuing his monologue. "I ask." Two black gloves touched each other, creating a sharp movement. She sat quietly, commenting on her actions and mentioning the unacceptability of the gestures of the man opposite her. Her look was stern as she said that the officer had bad habits from his master. The man looked at the woman with a serious expression. "You have no right to say that," the officer reported. "We have arrived. I will take you to the throne room, madam." The man in uniform said, "I don't think this is the time for a leisurely chat about old times," the officer suggested. "So let's put it off until next time." She nodded, not objecting. Evelyn sat looking at the outstretched gloved hand, as if waiting for a reaction. But she never responded. She looked surprised, her eyes wide open as if she had seen something incredible. Finally, they nailed it into place. The large white castle with towers was illuminated by bright sunlight. Evelyn stood in front of the man in uniform and answered briefly. "Number." She said that the old dirty stories had no meaning. The man listened without trying to argue. A man in uniform with a serious expression and yellow eyes watched her every move carefully. The lady was accompanied by a military man, and there were 4 more soldiers standing on the sides. The man in the red coat spoke of their last meeting at Rowan's funeral. She listened in silence. Evelyn stood there, and he said that time had not hidden her beauty. She smiled slightly in response to his words. Finally, Ice rose Alteric. His voice was laced with sarcasm. The man added with a smile, "He's coming straight into my arms." His gaze was confident, as if he had already won. The bright throne room, with gilded elements and a luxurious chandelier, shone in the rays of the morning sun. Evelyn and the officer entered the hall. The atmosphere was solemn, their footsteps echoing throughout the spacious room. Someone was approaching and speaking. God, how many years, how many winters? The voice sounded with a note of surprise and warmth. The man in the red uniform approached with a smile. I thought I had forgotten your face, madam. Evelyn said one word with displeasure. Archduke. The girl asked how he was feeling, and he suggested being less cold. He put his arm around her shoulders and said, If you're cold, why don't we have some tea first? Evelyn looked at him without turning her head. She looked indignant. Thank you for your words, but the first thing to do is to clear up the misunderstanding with His Majesty the King. The blue-eyed man smiled and said, About the misunderstanding, the elder brother is not. The chronic disease is worsened. It seems he is not in his right mind. He has been fighting the disease for a long time. He continued, Will a little misunderstanding hurt him? I'm very worried. The second prince looked down at the lady, causing her to feel uncomfortable. She stared at him with a look that was even more empty than one could imagine. You don't have to worry. Rest assured, I will make sure that no one harms His Majesty. The red-haired prince replied, Well, I hope so too. He pointed at the colonel and said, They throw themselves so enthusiastically into anything connected with the rebels. After such a remark, the man asked, And did you meet your friend on the road? He's a hero for saving me when I was fighting in Binswell. We had a hard time convincing him to come over. He continued to praise the colonel. This man has no equal in pursuit. Old habits die hard, and I'm afraid he may have been rude to you on the way. Not at all. It never occurred to me that he was a mercenary. He is such a gentleman. The girl decided to play along and also began to praise everything and everyone. Two wonderful gentlemen. Evelyn understood that she needed to flatter these people who were in front of her, who would lead Alteric in the future. She played it so well. I'm about to cry, I can't wait to see it. After this phrase, the servant entered the room and announced, His Majesty the King asks to come in. Evelyn immediately moved towards the door to have an audience with the king, but she was stopped. Wait, madam. A hand in a white glove reached out to her, as if wanting to stop her. No need to try so hard. Even if you fall, you can count on me any time. The prince touched the girl's hair and continued. Stains left in the past. He smiled before continuing to speak. These stains can be easily erased. Evelyn realized that he was pressing on her emotions now, but she was not so easily broken. She looked at him coldly, and a thought popped into her head. So it was you who killed my husband? The prince's face darkened suddenly. It seemed as if the girl had just revealed some important secret. Then Evelyn, as if nothing had happened, began to walk towards the open door of the king's chambers. She smiled brightly and turned all her words about murder into a joke. I'm just kidding. The red-haired prince and the gloomy colonel were left standing alone in the corridor. The king's chambers were very bright. The light from the lamps filled the entire room, making it less gloomy than the corridor. The girl stepped over the threshold and said, I'm coming in. The king stood up and asked, Mrs. Winter, is that you? She stopped at the very door and answered, Yes, Your Majesty. The king extended his hand and said, Come here. There were some strange black marks on his skin. He spoke, closer. The girl continued to look at his hand, which was clearly visible to her, and was perplexed. She came up and took that hand in hers, then leaned over and kissed it as a sign of respect. She looked at the king. Please forgive my incompetence for not meeting you earlier. Meanwhile, in another room of this estate, it was quite noisy and lively. The table with the jug and glasses turned over and fell to the floor with a crash, as if someone had pushed it. The red-haired second prince put his hand to his forehead and lamented. This bad woman. He continued talking to himself. You still act so arrogant. Apparently you still believe. The colonel sat at the table and sipped wine, paying no attention at all to the cursing prince. The prince continued to wail. You still don't believe that he could die so easily. An image of the woman's husband floated into his mind. Rowan Winter. He must still be alive. The king's chambers, unlike the other room, were quite quiet and peaceful. The king said, This is our first private conversation since his funeral. The girl answered. Yes, he said. He was a great man. I thought his talent led us to glory. Continued to say something nice, and then switched to another. Victor is very greedy. During his time at the academy, Rowan must have been an eyesore because he always came in first place. I heard about your situation. This must have been Victor's plan. He wanted to intimidate you and take you under his wing. He continued, "Don't confront him directly. You can't do this alone." The king's voice grew quieter. Even if Rowan was gone, it was not the end for the Winter family. Evelyn put her hand to her chest and asked with interest, "What do you mean?" Meanwhile, in the other room, the showdown continued. "Do you understand me, Black? We have to find him. Find his corpse. I'll tear him to shreds right before her eyes. Don't forget who helped you get this far." The prince said to the colonel, "I will give you a portrait of Rowan Winter. Let's go to my office." The colonel replied, "I saw." This surprised the prince. "Saw? What do you mean?" The dark-haired man with the glass in his hand repeated it again. "I saw him." His words sounded sincere. The red-haired prince asked, "What connects you?" "The more I learn about you, the more unfamiliar you seem." The colonel tried to see something in the glass of red wine and find the words for his answer. In the end, he decided to settle on something less significant. A portrait. "I saw it with my own eyes." Pictures of bygone times began to emerge in his memories. A glass of muddy water and a brush in it. He clearly remembered clutching the paint spatula in his hands. His sadness and anger knew no bounds. The colonel remembered how bitter tears flowed in streams from his eyes, and he could not accept it. That portrait. He was sitting in a room with only an easel as furniture. In front of him was a portrait of Rowan and Evelyn, painted by me. But he didn't dare say it. He just pushed the thought out of his head. The dialogue continued in the king's room. "All the blessings and glory of the Duchy of Winter belong to the living. As long as I'm here, this last barrier of the Altaric Empire will be alive and well. Give me a chance to make things right." The colonel raised the glass to his lips and said, "I will definitely find him." At the same time, Evelyn said to the king, "Let me prove it." Their goals were too different. The golden gates of the palace shone in the light of the lamps. The audience was over. Evelyn stood next to a man in a white frock coat on the red carpet. The second prince couldn't help but notice. "You've grown gloomy, madam." Victor walked up the stairs and asked about the conversation. "I hope your conversation went well." Evelyn and her companions stood, and he reminded them that they needed to return immediately. Victor expressed surprise, calling the king heartless for his decision about the widow. He offered to accompany Evelyn. She looked at him carefully. She looked quite strange. "I encountered such different attitudes towards her from one person." Victor extended his hand. The bastard son of a concubine joined the army and strengthened his position. Evelyn's eyes were wary. He, dissatisfied with the title of Archduke, wanted to take the throne. The man in uniform stood, preparing to realize his ambitions. It was difficult to gain support in the Altaric Empire. Victor extended his hand to Evelyn. He wanted to strengthen his position through Princess Winter. Then he offered to dance, but she politely declined. Victor touched her hand softly, calling out to her. His intention was quite clear. He declared that this was the last time he would make the first move. Evelyn looked at him coldly. Someone suddenly screamed behind Victor, "Uncle!" The people around watched what was happening in surprise. One of them asked what Victor was doing. Joshua Altaric, first in line to the throne, approached indignantly, blaming Victor for the woman's anxiety. Evelyn stood next to the stranger and asked, "Joshua, what is His Highness doing here?" The officer looked at Joshua with an expression of displeasure and tension. Then Joshua turned to Evelyn. "More importantly, madam, long time no see." His gaze was directed at Evelyn, and his face turned a little red. Evelyn bowed and replied, "It's good to see you again. I'm honored that you remember me," Joshua said. "Of course I remember you. I heard about the hardships you went through." The girl answered, "You don't need to think about that now. I heard that His Highness will graduate from the academy with honors." Suddenly, Evelyn approached Joshua and grabbed his hands, saying, "The graduates of the academy were the backbone of the Altaric Empire. This is a reason to be proud. I want to be a great man like Duke Winter." His voice trembled with excitement. Evelyn said, "My husband would be glad to hear it. Your Highness, may I ask you a favor?" She looked confused, admitting that she had no crew to return with. She mentioned the wolf attack. All this time, the unique military man stood and watched the situation without emotion. She asked to be allowed to use the carriage. She believed that there might be dangers ahead. Victor was slightly surprised to hear such a request from Evelyn Winter. The man in uniform watched carefully, his gaze remaining cold and distant. Of course, Joshua immediately agreed to her request. The girl said, "It's an honor for me." After which Evelyn, without letting go of his hand, knelt down in front of Joshua. And while Joshua didn't understand what was happening, Winter said, "I will never forget this favor, as long as Altric lives." And kissing his hand, she added, "The Winter family pledges allegiance to you." A group of men stood at a distance, watching what was happening. The soldiers stood nearby and thought, not only did she ruin the Archduke's plans, but she also trampled them into the mud. The white-haired man in uniform was in anticipation. What would happen next? Next to him stood the colonel, whose face usually expressed nothing. But now he was laughing, after which he noticed that the colonel was smiling, and did not understand why. Joshua then ordered the lady to be escorted to the carriage immediately. Victor leaned toward Evelyn and whispered, "Do you think you can chase two hares?" She looked away, her green eyes doubtful and thoughtful. And as Victor passed by, she replied, "It is better to be the hunter than to become the prey." Victor walked away on the red carpet, laughing loudly. "Funny, funny." Victor, looking into the distance, uttered a threat. "You will regret this." After which, the officer called out to her, calling her lady. The officer said they were near a conflict zone and offered to accompany her to the border. She said, "Should I have told you that the wolf pack was about you?" The man replied, "That's not necessary." This made the girl lose her temper a little. She looked at the carriage she was about to get into. The threshold was very high. Evelyn continued to stand in front of the carriage, not knowing how to get in there without making a fool of herself. The officer knelt down and said, "I will help." Evelyn looked at him with a little disdain and asked, "What are you up to?" He raised his head and said, "Nothing of the sort. As a gentleman, I only wish to help the lady." The girl's cheeks flushed. This made her memories return to the old days. The man held out his hand for Evelyn to lean on. There seemed to be no catch, but as soon as the girl had one foot in the carriage, something strange happened. At some point, she realized that she was falling somewhere down. It was unexpected and not good, he stated. The heel was broken. After all, he could see better what had happened there. He said, "You have had a lot of troubles lately. Please rest a little in the mansion." She looked at him with even more contempt. "Don't pretend to be worried. It's disgusting." The man didn't dare raise his head and mumbled, "I don't know how that might sound." Then he looked at her and said, "But I'm glad you're feeling better." She stared at the colonel with a look of complete incomprehension on her face. She couldn't believe what he had said, but the man continued to say some nonsense. "I am sincerely grateful to God." His words seemed as insincere as possible. Evelyn threw her shoe with a broken heel. She shouted at him, "Never show your face in front of me again." She looked angry. The carriage door slammed shut with a loud bang. Evelyn vented her anger in that movement. The white-haired man, who had been standing next to the colonel all this time, turned to him. He continued to look ahead, but addressed the dark-haired officer. "For some reason, you look pleased." The colonel had his back to him, so his emotions were not visible. "Really? I don't think so." He watched the carriage with Evelyn Winter in it drive away, unable to comprehend what had just happened. The man did not take his eyes off, thinking about something. "Do you remember what you taught me, lady? The highlight of the hunt is the very moment when the prey stops running and bares its teeth. The victim hopes to be saved." "I'm glad you're well." He couldn't stop thinking about her. The colonel also thought about her family happiness. "I'm glad you love your husband and child." Evelyn was asleep in the carriage at the time. "I'm glad you have honor to defend." He finished his thought by thinking, "I'm glad you still have something to lose." And it seemed like he wasn't as cold as he was trying to be. In fact, he still had feelings for her. The colonel couldn't take his eyes off the place where the carriage was. "Thank you, lady, for teaching me to love." Then he remembered how he grieved in the room with the portrait, and for showing the cruelty of love. The colonel smirked. His face showed no warmth. "I'll teach you a lesson." Meanwhile, the girl was animatedly gnawing her fingers under her gloves, sitting in the carriage. "For leaving me behind." The expression on his face was rather strange. He grimaced with disgust. "Thank you very much." The man with the documents was enthusiastically presenting his ideas. The construction was successful, but the locomotive exploded on the bridge, scattering debris and fire. The project was shelved. Isaac argued. Maybe there was a mistake in the plans. There could be threats from neighboring countries. Evelyn looked ahead confidently. Big words, Isaac. The plan is perfect. She stood in front of the bed, listening. Support him as a representative of the aristocracy. It will help. She bowed her head, saying, We will take care of the churches and salons. Evelyn was kneeling by the bed, her voice firm. That was good. A long-forgotten project will bring Alteric to the light, the man repeated. Evelyn placed her hand on her chest and said, I, Evelyn Winter, will renew it. Her gaze was full of determination. The fate of our family depends on this. Evelyn held the papers and said, I can't back down. She and Isaac approached the guards. One of them said, Sorry to interrupt, but access is restricted. 3 military men in strict uniforms approached. One of them asked, Could you show me your entry permit? The military man said with a grin, This is the first time I've seen business projects being implemented in such ruins. The man turned to her with a serious look. Could you please go back? Evelyn replied sharply, maintaining a cold tone. The project was entrusted to me personally by His Majesty. It is you who must go. She and Isaac and the soldiers came closer. Silence surrounded them. The wind howled over the ruined bridge. She handed the papers to Isaac and said, The documents are a mess. Bring the drawing after the modification. The man ordered the officers. Lieutenant, Junior Lieutenant, stay back, he warned her. Even if you are the lady of the Winter family, it is dangerous to be here alone. The officer looked at her sternly and said, Let's get down to official business. Evelyn looked away thoughtfully, her eyes downcast. She thought, They're obviously spying on me. The man with red hair smiled arrogantly. After the events of the Archduke affair, everything changed. The young officer sat on a chair and looked forward. I'm glad you feel better. She narrowed her bright eyes. I don't have time to worry about meaningless things. Evelyn looked up at the sky, her bright green eyes sparkling despite the freezing temperatures around her. She stood in front of the gloomy bridge. Now Evelyn extended her hand forward toward the tower. I must deal with the legacy Rowan left behind. She moved closer to the dark tower, leaning her head against the ruined bridge. The girl closed her eyes, trying to rest from the tension, but only Rowan was spinning in her thoughts. Huge stained glass windows illuminated the hall. The country is going through turbulent times. The voice repeated. The man in the waistcoat wrote in a book, holding a pen with a bright nib. We must develop free trade. Evelyn tilted her head, thoughtful. Remember, ladies, Brington Bridge. The man seemed to embrace her. He will be the light that will illuminate this dark time. The red bridge was falling apart, sparking and cracking, the structure crumbling under the pressure of time. The man with golden eyes froze, turning sharply, his gaze expressing excitement. The girl standing in front of the red tower heard a voice. Lady! Her gaze instantly filled with anxiety. Evelyn stood there, shocked by what was happening. Light and shadow fell on her face, emphasizing her fear. The sudden fall of the debris stunned everyone, and she and Gillas found themselves on the ground, protected from the debris. Gillas held Evelyn, who was breathing heavily after the fall. Are you okay? Her foot in the shoe touched the icy surface, sinking into a crack. The man with a cold gaze watched the situation. He was wearing dark clothes and holding her by the shoulder. You might freeze. Evelyn frowned and pressed her lips together, fear flashing in her eyes. Their fingers touched, but she immediately pulled her hand away. Evelyn, with green eyes, recoiled back. Don't touch me! Her voice sounded indignant. He dropped to one knee next to Evelyn. They were on cracked ice, with snow all around them. The man spoke confidently, looking at her. You can lose your toes because of your stubbornness. Evelyn replied with an icy tone, looking him in the eye. The only thing that needs to be cut off is your tongue. She sat in the snow, and the wind only grew stronger. The man had already risen from his knee, watching her. Evelyn turned around, his voice filled with concern. You don't want to freeze to death, do you? The man helped her up. The wind was getting stronger. Please, let's go. She looked at him, clenching her teeth. This guy. Gillas stopped and looked at Evelyn. We should wait out the snowstorm. They walked along a snowy path, the snowfall increasing around them. They came to a lonely house. Gillas pointed ahead. Right here. Before her stood an old hut in the snowy forest. Evelyn recognized it. Evelyn looked ahead in surprise. She thought, "This is the same little house." And then memories came flooding back to her. How several years ago they had retreated to this very hut. Everything around was creaking from the age of the materials, and sighs could be heard. And on the old bed, she and the young colonel kissed while sitting on top of him. But a lot of time had passed since then, so everything had already rotted and there were cracks in the house. After which they entered the house together, as they had then. But there was disorder around. There was a very strong snowstorm outside, so the idea of waiting it out in the hut was the best. Entering the room, the Duchess sat down, and the colonel, examining the hut, said, "Until the snowstorm stops, we will sit here." Snow swirled around the wooden house with a chimney. He put his hands in his pocket and said, "We need to get some firewood to start the caster." Gillas looked forward and was immediately plunged into memory as well. After all, in front of him was the very same bed on which they had kissed together, but now there were ruins there. Evelyn didn't want to go back to the old way and said, "I've long forgotten this place." Gillas examined the book he had found and, throwing it into the fire, replied, "And indeed," after which the fire flared up even more strongly. The crackling of flames filled the room. Throwing books on the fire to keep it going, the colonel asked, "Don't you need to dry your clothes?" Sitting with her back to the fire, she muttered discontentedly, "I have a feeling of déjà vu." Then the man sat down and answered, "It's not worth it. Or have you forgotten that I'm a soldier?" Evelyn tilted her head mockingly and said, "A soldier? More like a child with a knife." After this, Gillas immediately stood up and looked down thoughtfully. For some reason, Gillas extended his hand towards Evelyn, after which he abruptly grabbed the girl's hair and sniffed it, enjoying the aroma. Evelyn grabbed her hair, startled by Gillas's actions. Her eyes widened in surprise. The girl answered thoughtfully, "I can even walk home alone." "Stop it," the man said mockingly, rolling his eyes. "In that case, you'll freeze to death." The woman smiled slightly and covered her face with her hand. "The Archduke will like this." The man raised his head, expressing boredom. "You talk so boringly." The man turned his gaze to the dilapidated roof, in which many holes were visible. The boy's yellow eyes dimmed and became more cloudy. He frowned slightly. The man said, turning away from the girl, "This place reminds me of old times." The girl looked up at him with a surprised look in her green eyes, with which she carefully studied him. The man said, as if asking her, "After all, what's done can't be undone." The girl finally decided to turn around and frowned, asking the man again, "What?" The man lifted his chin and asked arrogantly, "Do you really love Rowan Winter? Can you handle this on your own?" He asked, coming closer. He asked, "Does he really love you? And is he okay with putting his love in danger?" The girl screamed, interrupting him because she didn't want to listen anymore. "Stop it," she said. "That's a strange question, Colonel. Why do you ask as if he were alive?" The girl asked in bewilderment, leaning over. "You are like that. Are you really loyal to the Archduke? The war hero was kicked out of the capital. Maybe you're just pretending?" the girl reasoned. Then the girl extended her hand, dressed in a black glove, to the guy. She stroked Gillas's cheek, saying, "I see you don't really believe in yourself." The man answered thoughtfully, watching her. "I don't think it's any of your business, lady." The girl told him plaintively, "You are like a dog that cannot bite its owner." The guy grabbed her hand, saying, "You are so suspicious and pushy. Is that noble?" The girl laughed, turning away from him. "You asked if I loved?" "Of course I did," said the girl. Her snow-white hair fell over her face. She grabbed the man by the shirt, saying, "Our relationship has been blessed by God." She kept repeating fearfully, "This is not something that can be simply ignored." But then the man took her by the shoulders and sat her down on a chair that was very close. The man turned away from the girl wearily, almost rolling his yellow eyes. He looked tired. His gaze fell on the old bed. The snowstorm was gradually receding, which was visible through the slits. That day, the man said, completely lost in his memories. His pupils became cloudy. He remembered the blonde hugging him and kissing him. He kept saying, "Even after doing this here." The man asked, puzzled, as if he was angry, "You still wore a white dress on your wedding day?" The man kept repeating, "Shamelessly declares chastity." The girl got up from her chair. Did you swear your love in front of everyone? The man asked. And the girl snapped. Shut up! His face clouded with anger, and the man finally spoke. Swearing with a mouthful of lies? But in response, he received only a slap in the face from the girl, who looked angry and spiteful. The girl's gaze immediately changed, became more tired as she repeated, I told her to shut up. The man ran his finger across his lips, telling the girl, You'll never get to heaven, lady. The angry girl slapped the man again. He didn't even try to resist. She repeated, closing her eyes. You act as if you are attached to your dirty past.